Emma had never been the kind of person who paid much attention to her neighbors. She wasn't unfriendly, just private, the kind of woman who liked her home to be a sanctuary, not a social club. When she bought her house in this quiet suburban neighborhood, she hadn't expected much in the way of drama. It was an older area, the kind of place where people had lived for decades, where they mowed their lawns on Sundays, waved politely from their driveways, and largely kept to themselves. That suited her just fine. After years of living in noisy apartment buildings, dealing with thin walls and invasive landlords, having her own space felt like the ultimate luxury. She wanted peace, independence, and a place where she could come home after a long day, lock the door, and not have to deal with anyone unless she chose to. At first, it seemed like she had gotten exactly what she wanted. The house was perfect, modest but solid, with a small backyard, a sturdy oak tree that provided just the right amount of shade, and a mailbox mounted on a wooden post near the sidewalk. She liked the way the house felt, like it had been waiting for her. There were little signs of its history, a worn spot on the hardwood where a chair must have sat for years, faint outlines of where pictures had once hung but nothing that felt intrusive. It was hers now, and she was ready to make it her own. Then there was the neighbor. Emma had noticed the woman on the very first day she moved in. While she unloaded boxes from the moving truck, the elderly woman stood across the street, arms crossed over her chest, watching. Not in the friendly, curious way that some neighbors do when they see someone new arrive, but with an intensity that made Emma feel like she was being judged. She had smiled, lifted a hand in a casual wave, but the woman had simply turned and walked back into her house without acknowledgement. That was fine. Emma didn't need a warm welcome. If anything, she preferred it. It wasn't until a few days later that she had her first real interaction with the woman. She was coming back from the grocery store, juggling a couple of bags in one arm while she fumbled for her keys, when she heard a voice from the sidewalk. "You're the new owner." Emma turned, startled, to find the woman standing at the edge of her driveway. Up close, she looked to be in her 70s, with steel gray hair cut short, a crisp beige cardigan over a pale blue blouse, and the kind of posture that suggested she had spent most of her life issuing commands. Her face was sharp, lined not with age so much as with disapproval, as if she had spent years frowning at the world and had never quite stopped. Emma shifted the grocery bags in her arms. "That's right," she said, forcing a polite smile. "Emma." The woman didn't introduce herself. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, eyes narrowing as she looked past Emma, toward the house. "I knew the previous owner well, Mr. Henderson." Emma nodded, unlocking the door and pushing it open with her shoulder. "Yeah, I heard he lived here for a long time. 42 years, the woman corrected. And I took care of the mail for him." Emma blinked, caught off guard by the statement. "Oh." The woman nodded toward the mailbox. "It's on the street. Anyone can walk right up and take things. He didn't like that, so I kept a key. Picked up his mail every day. Sorted through it, made sure nothing was stolen." Emma felt a flicker of unease. She hadn't heard anything about this arrangement. It struck her as odd, an unnecessary level of involvement for a neighbor, but she kept her expression neutral. "That's nice of you." The woman smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. It was the practical thing to do. Emma didn't like the way she said it, as if this was some sort of expectation rather than a past courtesy. "Well," she said, keeping her voice light, "I appreciate the offer, but I think I'll be okay handling my own mail." For a moment, there was silence. The woman's expression didn't change, but something in her gaze sharpened, like a blade being honed. Then, just as quickly as it came, the tension vanished, and she gave a small nod. "Of course," she said. "If you change your mind, just let me know." Emma forced another smile, mumbled something about needing to put away her groceries, and quickly stepped inside. She locked the door behind her, an old habit from city life, and exhaled slowly. Something about the interaction left her unsettled, though she couldn't quite put her finger on why. It wasn't just the woman's insistence, it was the way she had said it. The assumption that Emma would just agree, like this was a matter already settled rather than a new arrangement being proposed. Over the next few days, Emma noticed her neighbor more and more. She was always outside sweeping the walkway, trimming her rose bushes, or just standing on her porch, staring. Each time Emma went to check her mailbox, she had the distinct feeling of being watched. Once, when she pulled an envelope from the box, she glanced up and saw the woman standing on her front steps, eyes locked onto her movements. Emma had frozen, letter in hand, and the woman had simply turned and gone back inside, as if the moment had never happened. It wasn't just paranoia. The woman was watching her. Then, one morning, Emma walked outside to find her mailbox open. It was subtle, just slightly ajar, the way it might be if the wind had blown it loose, but the latch had been shut the night before. She was sure of it. Inside, her mail was stacked neatly, nothing missing as far as she could tell, but something about it felt off. Had she simply forgotten to close it all the way? Or had someone? She turned her head instinctively, scanning the street. Across the way, the woman was out in her yard, pruning a hedge, but she wasn't looking at Emma. Not this time. Still, Emma couldn't shake the feeling that she knew. A few days passed without incident, but then the neighbor appeared again. "You really should let me take care of it," she said, her voice softer this time, almost coaxing. "It's not safe, leaving your mail out like that. You never know who might go through it." Emma hesitated. The wording was strange, too pointed. "Like I said before," she replied, keeping her tone even, "I've got it under control." The neighbor stared at her for a long moment. Then, with a tight, thin-lipped smile, she said, "Suit yourself." She walked away without another word. Emma knew, then, that this wasn't over. She just didn't know how far it was about to go. Emma tried to push away the unease that had been growing in the back of her mind ever since that last conversation with her neighbor, but it was becoming increasingly difficult. There was something about the way the woman had looked at her, the way she had spoken, that felt less like concern and more like a warning. Maybe it was paranoia, maybe it was just the stress of moving into a new home and adjusting to an unfamiliar place, but the feeling never quite left her. She told herself she was imagining things, that the woman was just an eccentric old lady set in her ways, but then little things started happening. Small, seemingly insignificant details that, on their own, might not have meant anything, but together, formed a picture that was impossible to ignore. It started with the mailbox. Emma made a point of checking it every evening when she got home from work, a simple routine she had never thought much about until she began to notice inconsistencies. Some days there would be mail when she knew there shouldn't be, as if letters had been delivered at odd hours. Other days she would receive nothing at all, even though she had been expecting bills or packages. Once she found an envelope addressed to her, but the flap was slightly torn, just enough to suggest that someone had tried to peek inside. Another time she pulled out a stack of letters only to find that they had been rearranged in a way that was too deliberate, too organized, as if someone had sorted through them before she even got to them. Then, one evening she stepped outside and found the mailbox standing wide open. It had been latched shut earlier that day, she was sure of it, but now, the door hung open, the inside empty except for a single flyer for a local business. The wind could have blown it open, maybe, or some kid could have played a prank, but the uneasy feeling in her stomach told her otherwise. As she stared at it, debating whether or not she was overreacting, she heard the sound of a door closing across the street. She turned her head just in time to see her neighbor, Miss Quinn, stepping back inside her house, pulling the door shut with slow, deliberate movements. Emma's pulse quickened. She wanted to believe it was just a coincidence, but something about the way Miss Quinn had disappeared into her house, so quickly, so quietly, made her skin prickle. That night, Emma lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, her mind running in circles. If it had been Miss Quinn, what was she trying to accomplish? Was she just trying to unsettle Emma, to prove some kind of point, or was this something more? The thought that the woman might have actually been going through her mail made her stomach turn. It wasn't just invasive, it was illegal. But even if she went to the police, what could she say? That an old woman had been acting suspiciously. That her mail felt like it had been tampered with? There was no proof, no concrete evidence, just an overwhelming sense of dread that refused to go away. The next day, Emma decided to take action. She bought a new mailbox, a sturdy metal one with a lock and a reinforced slot, something that couldn't be easily tampered with. She installed it herself, taking her time to make sure everything was secure, then tested the lock several times to ensure it worked properly. When she was done, she stepped back, crossing her arms as she looked at it with a sense of satisfaction. "Let's see you get into this," she thought. That satisfaction was short-lived. The next morning, when she stepped outside to check her mail, she found something that made her blood run cold. The new mailbox was still locked, still intact, but there was something taped to the front of it, a small, square piece of paper with just 2 words written in neat, precise handwriting. "Not necessary." Emma stared at the note, her fingers tightening around it as she ripped it off the metal surface. She turned, scanning the street, looking for any sign of movement, but everything was still. Too still. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end as she realized just how calculated this was. Someone had come onto her property, had taken the time to leave this message, and had done it so quietly that she hadn't heard a thing. She went inside, locking the door behind her, her heart pounding. This wasn't normal. This wasn't just some nosy neighbor being overbearing. This was deliberate. Someone was trying to get inside her head, trying to make her feel like she was being watched, controlled. And the worst part? It was working. Determined not to let this continue, Emma did something she had never done before she filed a report. She didn't have much to go on, just a series of unsettling incidents and a gut feeling that something was very, very wrong. But the officer she spoke to took her seriously. He listened as she explained what had been happening, nodding occasionally as he jotted down notes. When she was finished, he leaned back in his chair and folded his arms. "It's good that you're reporting this," he said. "But without any real proof, there's not much we can do. Have you seen her physically tamper with your mailbox?" Emma hesitated, then shook her head. "No, but I know it's her. It's too much of a coincidence." The officer nodded slowly. "I get it. And honestly, your best bet right now is to keep an eye on things. Maybe install a security camera, something to catch any suspicious activity. If you get something concrete, bring it to us, and we'll take it from there." Emma left the station feeling both reassured and frustrated. She wanted something to be done, but at the same time she understood without evidence, without something more than a bad feeling and a few weird incidents, there was no real case. Still, the officer's advice stuck with her. A camera. That wasn't a bad idea. But before she even had the chance to set one up, things escalated. It happened just a few nights later. Emma had been sitting on her couch, watching TV, when she heard a noise outside. A soft rustling sound, barely audible over the hum of the television, but distinct enough to make her sit up. She muted the volume, holding her breath as she listened. There it was again. A faint shuffle, like footsteps on pavement. She stood slowly, moving toward the window, careful not to make any sudden movements. She peeked through the blinds, her eyes scanning the street, but at first she saw nothing. Then movement. A shadowy figure, standing near her mailbox, just barely visible in the dim glow of the streetlight. Her pulse hammered in her ears. She should turn on the porch light. She should yell. She should. The figure moved. Not away. Toward her house. Emma's breath caught in her throat as she realized what was happening. Whoever it was, they weren't just lingering, they were approaching. She stumbled backward, reaching for her phone with shaking fingers. But before she could dial, before she could do anything, the motion sensor light outside flicked on. And the figure froze. For a long, agonizing second, they stood there, caught in the harsh white glow, and Emma could see them clearly. Miss Quinn, and in her hand a key. Emma's stomach dropped. It was a key to her mailbox. A key that shouldn't exist. Emma couldn't move. Her body locked up as she stood there, staring through the window at the impossible sight before her. Miss Quinn, illuminated in the harsh glow of the motion sensor light, was standing at her mailbox holding a key. A key that Emma had never given her. A key that should not exist. It took a moment for her brain to catch up with what her eyes were seeing, to process the sheer violation of it. The woman wasn't just lurking, she wasn't just watching, she had come prepared with a key, as if she had always had access. as if she had the right. Something snapped inside her then, a surge of adrenaline overriding the shock. She wasn't going to stand there like a helpless victim, wasn't going to let this woman get away with whatever the hell she thought she was doing. Emma turned on her porch light and yanked the front door open with so much force that it slammed against the wall. The sound echoed through the night, sharp and sudden, but Miss Quinn didn't even flinch. Instead, she slowly turned her head, her gaze meeting Emma's with eerie calm, as if she had been expecting this confrontation all along. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Emma's voice was sharp, her hands clenched into fists at her sides, but Miss Quinn simply tilted her head, as if mildly confused by the question. The key was still in her hand, glinting under the light, her fingers wrapped around it like it belonged to her. "I was just checking," Miss Quinn said, her voice eerily composed, making sure everything was where it should be. Emma took a step forward, her pulse hammering against her ribs. "That is my mailbox, my property. You have no right to touch it." Miss Quinn sighed, a quiet, almost pitying sound, as if Emma were the one being unreasonable. "I told you before," she said. "I took care of this mailbox for years. I know how things work around here. It's not safe leaving your mail unattended." Emma's breath came fast and shallow. "I changed the lock," she snapped. "How do you have a key?" Miss Quinn's lips curved into something that might have been a smile, but it never reached her eyes. "Locks can be copied," she said simply. Emma felt her stomach twist. It was such a casual admission, so matter-of-fact, as if this woman didn't even consider what she was doing to be wrong. That realization made her blood run cold. This wasn't just a pushy neighbor refusing to respect boundaries, this was someone who genuinely believed she was entitled to control something that didn't belong to her. "I want the key," Emma said, stepping closer, holding out her hand. "Now." For a moment, Miss Quinn just looked at her, as if weighing her options. Then, without a word, she lifted her hand and let the key fall into Emma's palm. Emma clenched her fingers around it, a sick feeling curling in her gut at the thought of how easily this woman had been able to obtain it. "You need to stay away from my property," Emma said, her voice tight with barely contained anger. "If I catch you anywhere near my mailbox again, I will call the police." Miss Quinn's expression didn't change. "Oh, Emma," she murmured. "You don't understand, do you?" Emma's jaw tightened. "Understand what?" Miss Quinn's gaze flickered toward the house, her eyes scanning it as if seeing something Emma couldn't. "This place," she said softly, "it doesn't belong to you. Not really." Emma felt something cold slither down her spine. She forced herself to keep her expression neutral, to not let the woman see how deeply those words unsettled her. "Go home, Miss Quinn," she said, her voice flat. "Now." For a moment, it seemed like the old woman might argue, but then, without another word, she turned and walked back across the street, her movements slow and deliberate. Emma watched her until she disappeared inside her house, the door clicking shut behind her. Only then did she allow herself to exhale. Inside, she locked the front door, bolted it for good measure, then stared down at the key still clutched in her hand. She wanted to throw it away, wanted to pretend this hadn't just happened, but she knew that would be a mistake. She had proof now. A tangible piece of evidence that Miss Quinn had crossed a line. But proof of what exactly? A copied key wasn't a crime in itself, and even if she took it to the police, they would likely just issue a warning, the same way they had before. Frustration burned in her chest as she ran a hand through her hair. She needed to be smart about this. She needed to figure out exactly what she was dealing with. The next morning, Emma did something she never thought she would do. She visited City Records. It was a small, nondescript building on the edge of town, the kind of place no one really thought about unless they needed to dig up information. The clerk behind the desk barely glanced at her as she approached. "I'm looking for records on my house," Emma said, keeping her tone casual. "Previous owners, any legal disputes, that sort of thing." The clerk typed something into his computer, then raised an eyebrow. "You just bought that place recently, right?" Emma nodded. "A few months ago." He let out a low whistle. "That house has history." A chill prickled at the back of her neck. "What kind of history?" The man clicked through a few screens before turning the monitor slightly so she could see. There were multiple files, some dating back decades, and as Emma scanned the documents, her pulse quickened. The house had changed hands multiple times, which wasn't unusual, but there was a pattern. Each sale had followed some kind of dispute, complaints, legal battles. She frowned. Why were there so many issues? The clerk shrugged. Looks like there was some confusion over ownership. Nothing illegal, just odd. People thinking they had rights to the place when they didn't. Happens sometimes with older properties. Emma's fingers tightened around the edge of the counter. And Miss Quinn, she asked, forcing her voice to stay steady. Has she ever lived there? The clerk squinted at the screen. Nope. Her name's never been on the deed. Emma let out a slow breath. So Miss Quinn had never actually owned the house. But that didn't mean she didn't think she did. That night, as Emma locked up, double-checking the doors and windows, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. The street was empty, the neighborhood quiet, but she knew, deep in her gut, that this wasn't over. Miss Quinn wasn't just an intrusive neighbor. She was something else entirely. And Emma had a sinking feeling that she was only just beginning to understand what she was dealing with. Emma didn't sleep that night. Even after she double-checked the locks on every door and window, even after she pulled the curtains shut and sat with a kitchen knife within arm's reach, she couldn't shake the sensation that she wasn't alone. Not in the literal sense her house was empty, silent, except for the occasional groan of the old wood settling, but in the way that made her feel like something was fundamentally wrong. Like the air itself had changed, like the walls had absorbed something they weren't supposed to, something that made them press just a little too tightly around her. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Miss Quinn standing by her mailbox, holding that impossible key, looking at her with that eerie calmness that suggested she wasn't just violating a boundary, she was asserting something that Emma still didn't understand. By the time morning came, she was exhausted but too wired to rest. She needed to do something, to take control of the situation before it spiraled any further. The previous night, she had started looking into the history of her house, but now she wanted more. The clerk at City Records had mentioned disputes, ownership confusion, none of it illegal, but odd. That wasn't enough. She needed details, names, something concrete that would tell her exactly what kind of game Miss Quinn thought she was playing. She spent the next few hours making calls, reaching out to local offices, digging through online archives. The deeper she went, the stranger it became. She found articles about people who had lived in the house before her, none of them staying longer than a few years. The pattern was unsettling. Each new owner left abruptly, and while there were no reports of anything criminal, there were plenty of mentions of neighbor disputes. It wasn't always clear who the complaints were about, but some of the descriptions sounded disturbingly familiar. A local resident has repeatedly claimed rights to private property, despite no legal basis. Disputes over access to mail and property boundaries have resulted in multiple complaints, though no formal legal action was taken. Emma felt her stomach knot. This had been going on for years. Miss Quinn wasn't just obsessed with the mailbox, she was obsessed with the house itself. It made sense now in a way that sent a sick feeling curling in her gut. The strange way the woman had spoken, the note she had left not necessary. She had believed, truly believed, that Emma's attempt to secure her own mail was unnecessary because in her mind she was the one who was supposed to be handling it. She had positioned herself as something more than just a neighbor. A caretaker, a guardian, no. Something worse. Someone who had decided a long time ago that this house was hers in a way that went beyond legal ownership. Emma leaned back in her chair, rubbing her temples. She needed a break. She stood, stretching the stiffness from her shoulders, and stepped outside to get some air. The morning was still crisp, the sun barely cutting through the cool air, and for a moment she just let herself breathe. Then, as she turned to head back inside, she saw something that made her blood run cold. Her mailbox was open again. She had locked it last night. She was sure of it. She had checked. Heart pounding, she stepped forward, hesitating only for a moment before reaching inside. There was only one thing inside an envelope, old and yellowed, the paper brittle to the touch. No postage, no address, nothing to indicate it had ever been officially sent, just her name, written in careful, deliberate cursive. She turned, scanning the street, but there was no sign of Miss Quinn. The neighborhood was quiet, too quiet. With shaking hands, she tore open the envelope and pulled out the single sheet of paper inside. I told you before. Some things aren't meant to be changed. Emma's breath caught. This wasn't a warning. It was a statement. A fact, a reminder. She spun on her heel, marching across the street, not caring anymore about playing nice or being polite. She was done with this, done with the games, the messages, the quiet manipulations. She reached Miss Quinn's front door and pounded on it hard enough to rattle the frame. Nothing. She knocked again. Still no response. For a long moment, she just stood there, fists clenched at her sides, her breath coming hard and fast. She had expected her neighbor to answer, to meet her with that same infuriating calm, to act like Emma was the one being unreasonable. But the house remained silent, the curtains drawn, no movement inside. She wasn't home. Emma turned and walked away, but as she reached her driveway, she felt it again. That nagging sensation, the one that had been creeping under her skin for days now, whispering that something was off. She looked down the street, scanning the other houses, the trees, the parked cars, and then she saw her. Not inside the house. Not on the porch, standing just beyond the corner of the street, half hidden behind a tree, watching. Emma froze. Miss Quinn didn't move, didn't speak. Just stood there, her face unreadable, her eyes locked onto Emma with an intensity that sent a shudder down her spine. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then, finally, Miss Quinn turned and walked away, disappearing behind the houses. Emma stood there, heart pounding. This wasn't paranoia. It wasn't just some territorial old woman clinging to a sense of control. Miss Quinn was watching her, tracking her movements. And worst of all, she didn't seem the least bit afraid of being caught. Emma went inside, locking the door behind her, her hands shaking as she grabbed her phone. She was done letting this woman get inside her head. She dialed the police, waiting as the line rang once, twice, 3 times before connecting. "I need to report a trespassing issue," she said, forcing her voice to stay steady. "I have reason to believe someone is tampering with my mail and watching my house." The dispatcher asked for details, and Emma provided them, recounting everything that had happened: the stolen mail, the copied key, the messages, the silent surveillance from across the street. The woman on the other end listened patiently, then finally said, "We'll send an officer to take a report. But without any direct threats or proof of entry into your home, there's not much we can do beyond a warning." Emma clenched her jaw. A warning. Another empty gesture. But she thanked the dispatcher anyway and hung up, trying to ignore the frustration bubbling inside her. An hour later, a patrol car pulled up and a uniformed officer stepped out. Emma explained everything again, this time standing on her front porch, gesturing to the mailbox, to Miss Quinn's house, to the street corner where she had last seen her neighbor standing. The officer nodded, taking notes, but she could already see where this was going. "If she hasn't explicitly threatened you," he said, "then legally we can't do much. We can talk to her, let her know she's making you uncomfortable, but unless she trespasses or we catch her in the act of tampering with your mail, it's a gray area." Emma exhaled slowly. She had expected this, but it didn't make it any less infuriating. The officer offered a few suggestions: security cameras, filing another report if things escalated, but as he pulled away, Emma felt a sinking weight settle in her chest. Miss Quinn had been playing this game for years, and now Emma knew she wasn't going to stop until she got what she wanted. Emma was running out of patience. It wasn't fear anymore, not exactly, and it wasn't frustration either. It was something deeper, something colder, something that settled in her chest like a block of ice and refused to melt. The police had come and gone, leaving her with nothing but useless advice and a vague reassurance that they would keep an eye on things, but she knew better. There would be no consequences, no real intervention, not until something worse happened. And she had a feeling that it would. She had spent the rest of the day walking through her house, double-checking every lock, every window, making sure nothing was loose, nothing was vulnerable. The security measures were in place, the cameras were installed, and yet, despite all of it, she still didn't feel safe. Because Miss Quinn didn't just push boundaries, she ignored them completely, as if they didn't exist. That night, Emma sat in the dim glow of her living room, staring at the front door, waiting. She told herself it was paranoia, that she had done all she could for now, that she needed to sleep. But she couldn't. Something inside her refused to let her. Then, 3:17 a.m., the motion sensor light outside flicked on. She sat up so fast that her vision blurred. Her pulse hammered in her ears as she grabbed her phone, heart racing as she checked the security feed. The camera footage came up in black and white, grainy but clear enough to show movement. A shadow, a figure just at the edge of her property, standing by the mailbox. Emma clenched her jaw. It was her. Miss Quinn stood there perfectly still, not moving, not even trying to open the mailbox this time. Just watching. As if she were waiting for something, or maybe just letting Emma know without a single word that she could be here whenever she wanted. That there was nothing Emma could do to stop her. A surge of fury shot through her, stronger than fear, stronger than hesitation. She grabbed her phone and dialed 911, barely hearing the operator's voice over the blood pounding in her ears. "There's someone on my property," she said, voice sharp, steady. "My neighbor. She's been harassing me, tampering with my mail, and now she's standing outside my house in the middle of the night." The dispatcher asked her to stay on the line. Emma barely listened. Her focus was on the screen, on the unmoving figure. Then, without warning, Miss Quinn turned. Not away, not toward her own house. Toward the camera. Emma sucked in a breath. The woman lifted her hand slowly, deliberately, and tapped one long, bony finger against her lips. "Shh." Then she stepped back into the darkness. The police arrived 20 minutes later. It was the same routine questions, a patrol car rolling slowly through the neighborhood, an officer knocking on Miss Quinn's door only to receive no response. They left with another warning, another useless note in their report, and Emma was left standing in her own living room, phone still clenched in her hand, feeling the weight of something she couldn't explain pressing down on her chest. Miss Quinn knew about the cameras, and she didn't care. The next day, Emma called a locksmith. The front door, the back door, even the windows, she had everything reinforced, replaced with deadbolts, security pins, anything that could make her feel like she had some control over this situation. She changed the locks again, not because she thought Miss Quinn had a key, but because she couldn't shake the feeling that it didn't matter. That evening, as the sun began to set, Emma forced herself to go outside. It was a simple task, one that should have been automatic: walk to the mailbox, check for letters, go back inside. But as she stepped onto the porch, every nerve in her body screamed at her to turn around, to lock the door, to pretend none of this was happening. She clenched her jaw and kept moving. The mailbox was closed, locked. Nothing seemed out of place. But when she opened it, her breath caught. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded once, placed carefully in the center. She pulled it out, unfolded it with trembling fingers, and read the message written in the same careful, deliberate handwriting as before. "Locks don't keep people out. They just keep them in." Emma's breath hitched. She spun around, scanning the street, the sidewalk, the windows of the surrounding houses. Nothing. No movement. But the message was fresh, the ink wasn't smudged, the paper wasn't damp from the evening air. Someone had put this here recently. Her hands shook as she crumpled the note, shoved it in her pocket, and hurried back inside, slamming the door behind her. This was a game. A test. A way to see how far she would go before she broke. Emma refused to break. But she needed to be smarter. Instead of calling the police again, she took a different approach. She went online, searching for every public record she could find on Miss Quinn, digging deeper than she had before. Most of it was useless old property records, minor citations for zoning violations, but then she found something. A legal dispute from over 40 years ago. Miss Quinn had once filed a claim against the owners of Emma's house, arguing that the property had been wrongfully taken from her family. The case had been dismissed due to lack of evidence, but the details were chilling. The claim wasn't about money, or a will, or even land ownership. It was about occupancy. She had argued that no one else had the right to live in the house because it had already chosen its owner. Emma felt her stomach turn. Miss Quinn wasn't just obsessive. She was delusional. And Emma was now standing in the middle of whatever twisted belief system the woman had built for herself over the years. That night, she didn't sleep. She sat in the living room with the lights off, watching the street through the window, waiting for something she couldn't name. But nothing happened. No movement, no figures lurking outside. Just the deep, suffocating silence of the neighborhood. Then, around 4 a.m., her phone buzzed. A notification from her security app. Motion detected. Emma's breath caught as she opened the live feed. At first, she saw nothing. The empty street, the dim glow of the streetlights. But then she noticed something in the lower corner of the screen. A small, dark object on her porch. She hesitated, fingers tightening around the phone, then forced herself to move. She unlocked the door, stepped outside, and looked down. A single, rusted key lay on the welcome mat. Emma bent down slowly, hesitating before picking it up. It was old, heavy, the kind of key that belonged to something long forgotten. And attached to it was a note, "Come home." Poke. Emma's fingers clenched around the metal. She lifted her head, scanning the darkened street, her pulse pounding in her ears. She had spent weeks trying to figure out what Miss Quinn wanted. Now she finally understood. Miss Quinn didn't just think the house belonged to her. She thought Emma did too. Emma stood on her porch, gripping the rusted key so tightly that the sharp edge bit into her palm, but she barely felt it. The weight of it was wrong, too heavy, too solid, too deliberate, as if it had been waiting for her to pick it up. The note, simple and terrifying in its message, remained clenched in her other hand, the words "come home" echoing in her skull like a whisper she couldn't shake. The night air pressed against her skin, thick and unmoving, and though the street remained empty, she knew she was being watched. She turned her head, scanning the houses, the dark windows, the spaces between the streetlights where the shadows stretched too long. Miss Quinn wasn't outside. Not this time. But Emma knew she was there. Somewhere just beyond her sight, waiting. Testing. She had escalated. This wasn't just notes in the mailbox or standing in the dark to make a point. This was an invitation, a demand, a claim. Emma swallowed hard and backed into the house, locking the door behind her, bolting it even though she knew it wouldn't make a difference. The locks didn't matter. They never had. Miss Quinn had said it herself. They don't keep people out. They just keep them in. She set the key and the note on the kitchen table and paced, her thoughts tangled and frantic, every instinct screaming at her to do something, to act before this spun even further out of control. But what? Call the police again? They'd already proven to be useless. Confront Miss Quinn? She would just deny everything. Like she always did, standing there with that quiet, knowing look, like Emma was the one who didn't understand. Like she was waiting for Emma to catch up. Her eyes fell back to the key. It looked ancient, like something from another time, another house. But Emma's house had modern locks, and she had replaced all of them just days ago. This key didn't belong to her home, but it belonged somewhere. A sick, inevitable realization slithered into her mind. It was meant for her to find. Emma exhaled sharply and grabbed her laptop. If she couldn't stop Miss Quinn, if she couldn't make her go away, then she would find out exactly what the hell she wanted. She pulled up the files she had collected, the records of past owners, the lawsuits, the patterns of disputes. She stared at the timeline, at the names that had come before hers, at the strange, circular way this house had changed hands over and over again, as if no one could hold on to it for long. No one except Miss Quinn. Except she had never lived here. Emma's fingers hovered over the keyboard. It didn't make sense. If she was so obsessed, if she had spent decades claiming some unspoken right to this place, why hadn't she tried to own it? Why hadn't she found a way to take it for herself, Unless. A cold realization crept through Emma's veins. She switched tactics, digging deeper into property disputes, old claims, land ownership records. And then she saw it. Miss Quinn hadn't wanted the house for herself. She had been keeping it empty. The lawsuits, the complaints, the unsettling pattern of people leaving it wasn't about ownership. It was about something else. Some kind of territory, a claim that had nothing to do with legal rights and everything to do with presence. The house wasn't meant to be lived in. It was meant to be watched. Controlled. Preserved. Emma's breath came faster, her pulse hammering against her ribs as she stared at the records, at the list of people who had lived here before her. So many names. But one was missing. Miss Quinn's. And then it hit her. The house hadn't been taken from Miss Quinn. She had been left behind. A sharp, deliberate knock echoed through the house. Emma froze. Another knock. Slow. Rhythmic. Her skin went cold. It wasn't at the front door. It was coming from the back. She turned her head, heart pounding, gaze locked on the sliding glass door that led to the yard. The curtains were drawn, but she could see the faint outline of a figure standing just beyond the glass. Miss Quinn, not knocking to be let in, knocking to remind her that she was already there. Emma swallowed back the scream rising in her throat. She reached for her phone, her fingers shaking, but stopped. The cameras. She grabbed her laptop again, pulled up the live feed, her breath catching as the screen flickered to life. The grainy black and white footage showed her yard, the empty lawn, the fence. But the porch, she inhaled sharply. Miss Quinn wasn't alone. There was another figure standing beside her, a man, or something that looked like one. Tall, thin, slightly hunched, his head tilted at an unnatural angle as if he were listening to something only he could hear. His face was just out of frame, blurred by the low resolution, but his presence was unmistakable. Emma knew, in her gut, that he wasn't supposed to be there. Miss Quinn raised her hand and knocked again. Emma slammed the laptop shut. This wasn't just about her. It had never been just about her. Miss Quinn had been waiting for someone to move in, someone to fill the space, to become part of whatever this house had been built for. Emma felt her chest tighten. She had stayed too long. A whisper, low and almost imperceptible, curled through the room like a breath against the back of her neck. Come home. Emma ran. She grabbed her keys, bolted for the front door, wrenched it open, and nearly stumbled in her desperation to get to her car. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. Because she knew, without a doubt, that if she did, she would see him standing there, waiting. And this time, he wouldn't be behind the glass. Emma didn't stop driving. Her hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that her knuckles ached, but she barely felt it. The road stretched ahead, dark and empty, the headlights cutting through the thick night air, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she hadn't really left. That she was still standing in her yard, staring at the shadowed figure beside Miss Quinn. That she had never gotten into the car at all. The thought made her stomach lurch, but she forced herself to focus. She was miles away now, but distance didn't feel like safety. Not yet. Maybe not ever. She drove until the sun began to rise, until the dark gave way to the pale light of early morning, casting long, thin shadows across the empty highway. She pulled into the parking lot of a motel, her body aching from the tension she hadn't let go of, and checked in without bothering to look at the name of the place. It didn't matter. She just needed to be somewhere else. Somewhere that didn't feel like it was pressing in around her. Inside the room, she locked the door, bolted it, wedged a chair under the handle for good measure. Her skin felt wrong, too tight, as if something had clung to her during the drive, something she hadn't been able to shake off. The rusted key was still in her pocket. She pulled it out with trembling fingers, staring at it as it sat in her palm, the weight of it as heavy as the realization that had settled deep in her bones. She should throw it away. Drop it down the drain, bury it in the motel's parking lot, leave it behind, and never look back. But something told her it wouldn't matter. It would find her again. She set it on the nightstand instead and sat on the bed, exhaustion sinking into her muscles, but she didn't lie down. She couldn't. Her mind wouldn't stop replaying the moment she had seen the second figure, the way the camera feed had flickered, the way Miss Quinn had stood there, like she knew what Emma had seen, what she had come to understand. This wasn't just about the house. It was never about the house. It was about what stayed there. Emma's breathing was too shallow, too fast. She forced herself to focus, to think. She had run, but that wasn't enough. She needed to do something more, to break whatever cycle she had stumbled into. She pulled her laptop out of her bag, fingers unsteady as she opened it, and went back to the records she had found before. The names. The previous owners. The pattern. None of them had lived in the house for more than 5 years. Some had left quietly, without a trace, their names vanishing from public records as if they had simply ceased to exist. Others had been more public about their departure, legal disputes, restraining orders, desperate attempts to prove that something was wrong. One name stood out now, one she had overlooked before. A woman named Eleanor Quinn. Emma's stomach dropped. She clicked on the file, scanning the details, and there it was. Eleanor Quinn, died in 1979. Emma sat back, the breath punched out of her lungs. That wasn't possible. That wasn't possible. Miss Quinn had been standing outside her house just hours ago, but the date was there, clear as day, attached to a death certificate, her address listed as Emma's house. The same house she had never legally owned. The realization settled over Emma like a weight she couldn't lift. She hadn't been left behind. She had been watching. Keeping the house empty, keeping it waiting. For what? Emma knew the answer before she could stop herself from thinking it. For someone like her. Her hands were shaking now, her vision blurring as she stared at the screen. She wanted to believe it was a mistake, a clerical error, a coincidence, but she knew better. She had seen the second figure. And if Miss Quinn had been dead for over 40 years, then what had been standing beside her? A loud knock shattered the silence. Emma's body locked up. Not the front door. The motel window. The curtains were drawn. She couldn't see who was outside. Couldn't see if there was even anyone there. Another knock. Slow, rhythmic, like the one on her back door. Emma didn't move. Didn't breathe. The knock came again. She forced herself to stand, to move closer, her entire body screaming at her to stop. She reached the window and with trembling fingers pulled the curtain aside just enough to see. Nothing. An empty parking lot. No one there. No one visible. The knock came again. She backed away, her breath coming in sharp, shallow bursts. Her phone was in her hand, but she couldn't remember picking it up. She dialed 911, fingers numb, pressing the speaker button as the ringing filled the silent room. "This is 911. What's your emergency?" Emma opened her mouth, but no words came out. Another knock. And then a voice. Soft. Familiar. "Come home." Emma screamed. The line went dead. The motel room lights flickered once, and then everything went black. She didn't remember running. Didn't remember grabbing her bag, her keys, her laptop, throwing open the door and sprinting to her car, the engine roaring to life as she peeled out of the parking lot so fast that her tires screeched against the pavement. She drove without direction, without thought, just away, away, away until the motel was nothing but a memory, until the sun was rising again and her body was numb from exhaustion. She didn't stop until she reached a city she didn't recognize, until she was surrounded by people, noise, movement, things that felt real. Then, finally, she pulled into another motel parking lot, hands shaking as she turned off the engine. She sat there, staring at her reflection in the rearview mirror, at the hollow look in her eyes, the way her skin looked pale and stretched too tight over her bones. Then she looked down. At the passenger seat. At the rusted key sitting there, right where she hadn't left it. Emma let out a shaky breath. She wasn't going back, she wasn't going home. Not ever.